Hey guys, Mike's actually out of the office. It's spring break here in Rochester, Minnesota, so he's out on vacation, and he'll be gone for the week. But everybody else is here. Trisha's here, Missy's here, I'm here. Everybody at ECA is here. So if you have any questions, just feel free to call in as usual, and we can help you out. As usual, make sure you're doing your 15-minute drill daily. I always tell people you can't get better in a day, but you can get better daily. So when I hear people say, gee, I really wish I could do it as good as you, or I wish I could do it as good as Mike, you got to do it every day. And that's what that 15-minute daily drill is for, making sure that you're getting a little bit better every day. Also, make sure that you're getting this 5-minute moneymaker. That's a little tip that we send out every week. And this week's tip was the unexpected expenses graph. And so if these 5-minute moneymakers, really what they are, it's just something that we send out every week that is good information to have. It's something that if it percolates in the back of your mind is something that you may end up using with clients. You may not, but it's always helpful information. So make sure you're getting that. If you're not, let us know. Obviously, if you're new, and we just did a class Thursday and Friday, so those of you that are new haven't gotten one yet, but you should get one once you come on board. So today's call, here's something I hear a lot when I'm talking with advisors who are prepping for a prospect. So a lot of times they'll say something like this. They'll say, Jeff, these people are really sophisticated, and I'm not sure how to talk to them or what to show them. So what I want to do today is kind of drill in on that question. What do you show sophisticated people, and how do you talk to them? So first of all, let me be clear. I don't think you change anything with the 21-point checklist. So regardless of how sophisticated you might think they are, we're going to do the 21-point checklist the way that it's laid out, exactly the same. We're not going to change anything. But when you look to present solutions at the implementation meeting, what I've come to believe that you need to show all people, but especially sophisticated people, is a plan and not just a product. Now, there are all kinds of plans you can put together, and I think they're all equally effective at getting people to notice you and choose you. But today, I'm going to talk about putting together an income plan. And in particular, I'm going to show you the sale plans that we typically put together and use at 5Q. Now, I'm not going to walk you through the sales software on the website. I've done that before, and I'm going to assume that most of you are pretty familiar with the software. If you're new and you aren't familiar with it, that's okay. We can easily get you familiar with it, so that's not going to be a problem. Instead, what I'm going to do this morning is go through a way to talk about an income plan and put that income plan in perspective when you talk to people. But keep in mind as we go through this, what I'm about to show you is a way to talk about an income plan. It's not necessarily the way. So I don't want you to get all tripped up and think, oh, this is the way I have to do it. I don't think there's any such thing as the way. I think a lot of ways work, but this is a way. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. When you think about a mountain climber, when a mountain climber sets out to climb a mountain, what do you suppose his or her goal is? So let's see some answers. What do you think the goal of a mountain climber is? It's pretty obvious. Yeah, to get to the top. And that's the obvious answer. But if you ask experienced climbers this question, you get a little bit of a different answer. They would tell you that their goal is to make it all the way up and all the way down the mountain. Now, we've all heard of Mount Everest, right? And so what's famous about Mount Everest? Yeah, it's the highest peak or the highest mountain in the world. And because of that, it's become kind of a bucket list item for a lot of people. So it's not just professional climbers who are tackling Everest these days. It's a lot of everyday people who just want to say that they did it. And the popularity of climbing Mount Everest has exploded over the last 30 years. So in 1996, a writer by the name of John Krakauer decided he would go and check out this phenomenon of ordinary people going to Nepal to climb Mount Everest. And he was a freelance journalist, and so his idea was to write an article about it. So Krakauer signs up for a guided climbing expedition. And he said that when he arrived in Kathmandu, he was shocked at the sheer number of people who were there to do the same thing he was, which was climb Mount Everest. Turns out that leading these expeditions up Everest had become this huge business. And it was really crowded for a couple of reasons. First of all, a lot of people wanted to do it. And second, there was only about a 2-month window in the year when the weather was good enough to even attempt it. Now, I say attempt it because not everybody who tries is successful. In fact, the expedition that John Krakauer was on ended up being one of the deadliest ever. 8 people died on that expedition. And the story of what happened on that expedition is the subject of a book that also became a movie called Into Thin Air. Now, the saddest part, everyone who died on the way down the mountain. A fact that doesn't surprise experienced climbers. Most mountain climbing accidents and deaths occur on the way down a mountain, not on the way up. Now, you might wonder, why is that? Why do some climbers make it up and other climbers make it up but fail on the way down? You would think that getting down the mountain isn't any more difficult than getting up the mountain. If anything, you would think it was easier. And you might also wonder, well, what does any of that have to do with any of us here on the call? Well, here's the thing. For many of us, we have clients who are trying to get to a place where they can retire. And it's like climbing a mountain. They save and invest the best they can for years until they reach the summit and get to that place where they can finally quit working. And they assume that getting down the retirement mountain isn't going to be any harder or any different than the climb up. But what we're going to see is that it's a lot different. It requires a whole different set of skills. What worked on the way up doesn't always work on the way down. And so if you don't take away anything from the next hour or so, you should take away this. What worked on the way up doesn't always work on the way down. And so here's the million-dollar question. Why do some people make it up and down the retirement mountain while others make it up but run into problems on the way down? And again, what we're going to see is that what worked on the way up doesn't always work on the way down. I think it'll be a lot easier for us to see and understand this if we approach this problem not as a financial puzzle, but from the perspective of sports analytics. I happen to think that sports analytics can help us understand how success on the way up can sometimes blind us to the changes we need to make if we don't want to crash on the way down. And I want to use a soccer example only because people, at least here in the United States, probably aren't going to have strong allegiances or opinions that would cloud their thinking. So I hope that there aren't any Newcastle United fans on the call. If there are, I apologize. These next few minutes are going to be a little bit painful for you. Newcastle United is an English soccer club that plays in the English Premier League, and that's the top tier of soccer in England. And this is their stadium, St. James Park. And every other week during the soccer season, 50,000 die-hard fans fill this stadium to cheer the team. And instinctively, Newcastle United has all the building blocks of a successful club. So they have a billionaire owner willing to spend on the team, and they have a fan base that most clubs would die for. And despite that, they've always been kind of a perennial bad team. That is until 2012. In 2012, their fortunes changed, and they actually finished 5th in what many consider the strongest soccer league in the world. And it was an amazing accomplishment. All the experts at the beginning of the year predicted that Newcastle would struggle to stay out of the bottom of the standings, and here they were in 5th place. And so the fans were excited, and the ownership team at Newcastle United was excited. They thought they finally had the pieces in place to usher in a new era of success for the club. So they give the head coach and his entire staff an 8-year contract extension. And they did everything they could to try and keep all the players and the team intact because that's what you do when you finally have success. And the following year, this happened. Newcastle finished near the bottom of the standings, and no one had a clue what was going on. They had the same players, They had the same coaching staff. They even played in the same stadiums. Nothing had changed. And so, how does a largely unchanged team go from 5th to 16th in less than 12 months? Well, I'm going to answer that question, but first, a little background. There's a saying in all of sports that goes something like this. The standings never lie. Another way that I've heard it is, you are what your record says you are. And this saying more or less assumes that once the last game in a season is played, justice prevails. The team at the top of the standings is the best team, and the team at the bottom of the standings is the worst team. Everybody gets what they deserve. But it's not quite that simple, and let me explain why. This is Matthew Benham. He's an Oxford graduate in physics who decided to set up his own betting syndicate in London. It's basically an office full of PhDs and statisticians calculating the probabilities for the outcomes of soccer matches. And it's made him a very rich man. So rich, in fact, that he owns 2 soccer clubs. He owns the English club Brentford and the Dutch club FC Midtjylland. Now, I want to talk about FC Midtjylland for a moment. Midtjylland is a town in western Denmark, and it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. And at the time that Matthew Benham bought the team was broke, and they were at the bottom of the Danish league standings. And so what Benham wanted to see is if he could use the tools of a gambler, the big data and the analytics, to find a competitive edge and build a successful soccer club. Well, shortly after Benham took over the team, Midtjylland won their first ever Danish League championship, and they earned a berth in the Europa League tournament, where they defeated the mighty Manchester United from the English Premier League. Now it's Moneyball all over again, except in soccer. And so journalists and sports managers from all over the world flocked to Western Denmark to figure out how this team, that no one can even pronounce their name, suddenly rose to soccer stardom. So how did they do it? Well, if you want to understand how a gambler thinks, there's a concept that you must get, and it's this. The standings always lie. Now, why is a gambler saying that? Well, it's because he understands that soccer is a very random game, more random than basketball, for example. Now, why? Well, because soccer is a low-scoring sport. The average is 2.8 goals per game versus 92 baskets or 184 combined points in your typical NBA basketball game. So here's the principle. The fewer goals there are in a sport, the more impact random events will have. So some examples of a random event would be the ball being deflected in a soccer game and spinning into the net, or the referee making a bad call in the last minute of a match. Ultimately, the best team wins less often in a low-scoring sport like soccer than in a high-scoring sport like basketball, and that's why the standings lie. Now, the standings lie more after 10 games than after 20 games, but even after 38 games, a full soccer season, that's not enough games to strip out the randomness from the equation. 38 games is a very small sample size. And remember, there's money on the line. Gamblers are in the business of making predictions on the outcomes of games and backing those predictions with money. So when a gambler decides to back a team with a bet, he doesn't look at the standings. Instead, he looks at the underlying performance indicators that have more predictive value, things that are going to tell him where a team is going versus where it's been. So let's go back for a moment to Newcastle United's glory year and revisit that through the lens of a gambler. Now remember, all the experts were impressed with Newcastle's performance that year. They thought Newcastle was going to finish at the bottom, but they ended up finishing near the top. But gamblers were very skeptical. They looked at Newcastle's performance as something of a fluke, and here's why. One of the statistics a gambler trusts a lot is something called goal differential. It's the difference between the number of goals a team scores versus the number of goals their opponents score. And it's a very reliable indicator of a team's strength. Well, during Newcastle's glory year, Newcastle finished 5th with a goal differential of +5. Now look at the other teams on that chart. That's a long way behind the other teams. What this tells a gambler is that Newcastle had an extremely lucky goal sequence. So let me explain what I mean by that. All goals in soccer are important, but not all goals are equally important. So I'll give you an example. Let's say Newcastle scores 2 goals over 2 games and their opponents score 6. Well, Newcastle would be much better off winning a game 1-0 and losing the other game 6-1. That would be better than losing both games 3-1. See, it's the same number of goals, but a much more favorable sequence of those goals. And that's a really important point that we're going to come back to. So I want to make sure you guys get that. You can't just look at how many goals they scored. The sequence of those goals is a random factor that you have to account for. And it's a point that as financial planners we often make. You can't just look at returns. You have to look at how you got to that return. There's a degree of randomness in the sequence of a return that you have to account for. And if you dig deep into Newcastle's record that year, you find that they had a very favorable goal sequence. They had 8 wins by 1 goal, so 8 close wins, and 3 big losses by more than 3 goals in each of the 3 games. It's very unlikely statistically that you could repeat a season with 65 points and a goal differential of +5. Now, another statistic a gambler trusts is shot differential. It's the difference between the number of shots a team takes versus the number of shots the opponent takes. It's statistically well documented that better teams take more shots than worse teams. And if you look at Newcastle's shot differential the year they finished 5th, it was -1.4. Now look at these other numbers here in these other teams. Clearly, Newcastle United doesn't belong in this company. And to a gambler, this indicates an unsustainable goal conversion rate. So if you have a positive goal differential driven by a negative shot differential, meaning you score more goals, even though you take fewer shots, it's a fluke. It's a really lucky shot sequence. It's randomness playing a joke on the league. It would be like a business having a high share price and low customer satisfaction. Sure, you might be able to have that in any given year, but it would be impossible to maintain that year after year. So here's a visual of how gamblers saw the situation. So take a look at the black line. It shows the number of points that Newcastle scored in the 2 years, the one they finished 5th and the one they finished 16th. So let's call the black line results. The red line represents kind of the underlying analytics, or what we would call expected performance. If we looked at all the underlying analytics, the red line would be what we would expect that they would do. Notice that the year Newcastle finished 5th, they got a lot more points, so they got better results than their performance justified. In fact, if all you looked at was performance, that red line, you would see that they performed virtually the same both seasons. They just got less lucky the season they finished 16th. And this kind of reframes the original question. Why did Newcastle's ownership team not see this inevitable downturn coming? Why did they give the head coach an 8-year contract extension and keep all their players when it was obvious that this bubble was bound to burst at any time? Well, I think it was because Newcastle was blinded by something that psychologists call outcome bias. It's the assumption that good results are always the consequence of good decisions or better performance. Or if we put it another way, we could say success turns luck into genius. And this is where the message becomes about more than just soccer. When things go bad, we naturally ask ourselves, what went wrong? And what could we have done different? But when things go well, we just cruise along blinded by outcome bias. We expect our good results to continue automatically. We don't think we need to change anything. And what mountain climbers have learned is that good results don't just happen automatically. You would be a lot better off thinking like a gambler and being just as skeptical of your success as you were of your failure. That's how you make it both up and down the mountain. You don't take going down the mountain for granted. So let's stop and reflect for a second and ask ourselves, well, what does all of this have to do with the people we meet and work with as financial advisors? Well, like we talked about, presumably they've all made it successfully up the retirement mountain. And they've started, or they're about to start, on their way down. So what can we take away from our look at soccer analytics that might help us make it all the way down the retirement mountain safely? Well, I think there are three things that we can kind of take away. First, we need to be skeptical of our success. We need to ask ourselves the same hard question that we would have asked had we not made it up the retirement mountain or failed. We would have asked ourselves, how did this happen? So we need to ask ourselves this question, how did this happen? How did we get here? Second, we have to account for randomness. If 38 games in a soccer season is too small a sample size to strip out randomness, well then 25 years in retirement is too small a sample size to strip out randomness. We have to account for randomness. And then third, we need to use the tools of a gambler to make good bets going forward when we're planning our way down the retirement mountain. So let's start at the top by asking ourselves, how did this happen? How did we get where we are? Well, this is a graph of the Dow for the past 150 years. And you'll see that there are periods of ups and downs, but there are more ups than downs, which is why people are told just buy and hold. Even if the market experiences a downturn, eventually it will go back up, which, by the way, it always has. So I want to zoom in on the end of the graph, that blue line that starts with March 2009 to present. So see this bottom box? It says the latest monthly average is 211% above the 2009 low. Now, I'd say that's amazing, and it doesn't even tell the whole story because the market went on to do even better than that. In fact, it's better than that right now. At times, the market's been up over 300% from its March 2009 low. Let that sink in. People have tripled their money since the 2009 low. Now, let's look back at our sports analytics and mountain climbing examples. We saw that in the year that Newcastle United finished 5th versus 16th, their expected performance was nearly identical both years. So how is it they finished 5th that one amazing year? Well, like we saw, they were lucky. Everything fell their way. They had an extremely lucky goal sequence. The gamblers all knew that there was no way you could expect that performance year after year. I think it's even more obvious when you look at what happened at Mount Everest. Remember, climbing Mount Everest had become this bucket list item. And ordinary people, people with no technical climbing experience or expertise, were attempting to scale the mountain. And despite their lack of technical skill and experience, they were making it up. But many of them didn't make it back down. 8 people died on the expedition that John Krakauer was on and wrote about. So here's a question. What was the difference between the way up and the way down that day? I mean, if you had to guess, what would you think was the difference between going up in the morning and coming down in the afternoon? Any ideas? What could have been the difference? Yeah, it was the weather. The morning they climbed up, the weather couldn't have been better. It was a perfect day. It was calm and peaceful. So you didn't need any experience or expertise to make it up on a day like that. That's why ordinary people were able to get to the top. And that's where outcome bias can become a problem, because those people probably thought that the reason that they were able to summit the mountain was because of all their training and preparation. And I'm not suggesting that they hadn't done any training or hadn't prepared at all. I'm just saying that they would have been better off being just as skeptical of their success as they would have been of their failure. So we've all summited the retirement mountain, but have we asked ourselves the question, how did we get here? Well, we just experienced the longest running bull market in history. And I'm not suggesting that none of us, we didn't prepare or anything. We did. We prepared. We had to work hard to get to this place. We had to have a plan in place to save and invest. But did a strong market wind at our backs hurt us or help us on the way up? I mean, obviously, it helped us. Now, here's something interesting. This is a chart that looks at summiting the retirement mountain. So going up the retirement mountain, it shows what would have happened had you started with $100,000 and invested over a 25-year period, say from age 40 to age 65. Now notice the annual returns for both accounts. So there's one over here on the left. There's one over here on the right. The annual returns for both accounts are identical. They've just been flipped. You see that? The account on the left starts with a return of -12 and ends with a +29. The account on the right starts with a +29 and ends with a -12, but otherwise they're identical. Both accounts average 8% growth. They just have two different paths by which they get there. So what do you notice when you look at the ending balances? What do you notice? No difference. They're the same. It turns out that the key to success in summiting the retirement mountain is persistence, just continuing to save and invest year after year. Just as we always talk about, set it and forget it. Just set it and forget it, and you'll be fine. The market will always go up more than it goes down, and you'll make money. You'll be fine. Now, I alluded to the weather in the mountain climbing example, but it turns out that bad weather when we're talking about retirement isn't a down year or even 2 or 3, because there are down years. There are even multiple down years in both of these examples. And they both make it up to the top. So bad weather, it's not a down year. Bad weather is withdrawals. Look at what happens when you add withdrawals from a portfolio. These are the same scenarios from the previous example. So it's identical to the blue chart. The red chart is identical to the blue chart, both 25 years, same sequence of return. The only thing that's different is we added withdrawals to the red chart. And to keep it apples to apples, the withdrawals on both sides, on both accounts, whether it's the account here on the left or the account here on the right, are an identical 5%. But look at the outcomes. They couldn't be more different. If the blue chart represents going up the retirement mountain, the red chart represents coming down the retirement mountain. Notice how some people made it up and back down with no problem. Some people ended up with a couple $1 million at the end of their retirement. But some people who made it up don't make it back down. And it's not because they're taking more money, and it's not because they're taking money more often. Why then did these people stumble and fall? Well, it was untimely withdrawals. See, the problem is many investors were taught that storm clouds were downturns in the market. And because they were taught that, they have this mentality that if you just ride it out, just stick it out, the market will bounce back. See, sticking it out is how you make it up the retirement mountain without any problem. Just stick it out. That works, going up. But the red chart makes it super clear. The storm clouds aren't down years. There are the same number of down years in the exact same order on the blue chart. The storm clouds are withdrawals. Sticking it out doesn't always work on the way down. What worked on the way up doesn't always work on the way down. The only difference between these identical accounts on the red chart is the sequence of returns or the sequence of goals in our soccer example. And that's something we can't control. And it's something that has a degree of randomness that can't be stripped out in a typical 25 or 30-year retirement. It's just like Newcastle United. How did they go from 5th to 16th in a single year when nothing had changed? Well, they continued to think that the plan that got them to 5th would work forever. And if we aren't careful, as retirees, we can misdiagnose the reason for our success up the retirement mountain. And just like Newcastle United, we're susceptible to stumbling and falling on the way down. We got up the retirement mountain because the weather was good. We invested, we saved, and we didn't take systematic withdrawals. But remember, our whole goal in saving up the mountain was so that we could withdraw money on the way down. See, going up, we didn't have a plan for withdrawals because we didn't need one. But coming down the retirement mountain is a whole different story. In retirement, we must have a plan for withdrawals because we're going to experience bad weather even in good markets. And here's what I mean by that. This is a chart of the performance of the Dow from roughly 2000 to 2017. So what I want to do is focus on that period after this crash of 2008, from about here on. So from 2009 to 2017, were the markets good or bad? Good or bad markets from 2009 to 2017? Good, really good. Like we saw earlier, that was the longest running bull market in history. But notice that even during those great times, there were periods of downturns. Now, those downturns were admittedly temporary. They might only last 3 or 4 months. But if we continued to take withdrawals from during those times, we saw in the red chart how that could cause tremendous problems for us. There are going to be downturns even in good markets, and if we continue to take withdrawals, we could be in a world of hurt. So what can we do? Well, we can do what a gambler would do. We can account for randomness and play the odds. So let's take a step back and start by looking at a history of how income has traditionally been taken from a portfolio in the past. Now, we want our income to be two things. So think about your paycheck. When you're working, do you know how often you're going to get a check, or do they just kind of surprise you with it every once in a while? I mean, you know when you're going to get a check, whether it's every 2 weeks or every month, whatever it is, you know when you're going to get a check. So your income, in that case, it's reliable. You know when it's going to show up. And you pretty much know the amount of the check. I mean, they don't just surprise you with the amount, right? You know what the check is going to be for, give or take a few dollars. So from that standpoint, our income is both reliable. We know when we're going to get it, and it's predictable. We know how much we're going to get. Paychecks are reliable and predictable. That's why our Social Security checks are so important. They're like paychecks. They're reliable and predictable. We know when we're going to get them. We know how much they're going to be. That's what allows us to plan and budget. And ideally, we want all of our income in retirement to be reliable and predictable as well. That way, we can kind of plan and budget around it. So with that in mind, one way to plan for income in retirement is to invest in bonds. Bonds pay a set rate of interest, which is important for a couple of reasons. First, it's reliable. You know when to expect a payment. Second, it's predictable. You know how much you're going to get. It meets our criteria of reliable and predictable income. And you can easily calculate what you need to invest to get the reliable and predictable income you need. If you need $40,000 per year in income beyond your Social Security and bonds are paying 4%, you just divide 40,000 by 0.04 and you get $1 million. What that formula tells you is that if you invest $1 million in bonds that pay 4% per year, you'll get $40,000 each year in reliable and predictable income. Easy, right? But now, here's the question. Is $1 million a little or a lot? I mean, that's a lot. Now, not everyone needs $40,000 in income. That's just an example. You could cut the investment in half if you were only going to need half the income. But now if you have most, if not all of your money, because you have $500,000 or $1 million invested in one investment, what's the first drawback that comes to mind? If you've got all your money in one investment, what's the first thing that you start to think about? What's the first drawback? No diversification, right? I mean, that's one possible drawback, but there's another more serious drawback, and that is that you'd be exposed to interest rate volatility. So let's review. This is the example in the 21-point checklist. What happens when interest rates go up? What happens to the value of bonds? They go down. And what do we expect interest rates to do going forward? I mean, we don't know, but if we had to guess, we'd say they're going to go up. I mean, again, we don't know for sure what's going to happen over the next few months, but eventually interest rates are going to have to do what? Go up, which means the value of the bonds is going to go down. Now, again, if you were inclined to go ahead and build a bond ladder, investing in bonds for income, it could work. But there are two drawbacks that you have to factor in. The first is the amount of money that has to go into bonds. So you start to worry about a lack of diversification. And then you also have exposure to interest rate volatility. So while it could work, it's not ideal for those two reasons. And bond ladders used to be popular, but they're not recommended much anymore for all the things that we just talked about. Instead, what most advisors recommend these days is putting your money in a big bucket. Some of it's stocks, some of it's bonds, and that eliminates the diversification problem. And the idea is that you just withdraw a percentage, like 4 or 5% of the portfolio each year. Now, sometimes the money you take out will be from interest, sometimes from dividends, and sometimes from capital gains. And as long as the markets cooperate, you'll be fine. But why do I say as long as the markets cooperate? Well, remember, we're taking systematic withdrawals now to supplement our income in retirement. And we saw that the storm clouds were withdrawals during down periods. And do the markets always cooperate? Are they always up? Well, the answer is no. But we're always taking withdrawals. In fact, we saw that even in good markets, we could be taking withdrawals during down periods. Now, just as an aside, a lot of people think stocks and bonds are having stocks and bonds in your portfolio allows you to be diversified, that they act opposite of each other, but nothing could be further from the truth. In spite of what we've been told, stocks and bonds act alike. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that, but let me just give you one quick and easy reason that you can explain. Think of it this way. When interest rates go up, we know that bond values go down. But another thing happens when interest rates go up. Credit tightens. It becomes more expensive to borrow money. And when companies are forced to borrow less because of the cost of borrowing, they can't invest in equipment and inventory. That leads to slower growth, and that leads to their stock price falling. So eventually, if interest rates go up, not only do bond values go down, but stock prices go down. So we are in a situation where both stocks and bonds are down. And if there are no dividends or interest or capital gains because both stocks and bonds are down when you withdraw the money, if you still want the money, where does it have to come from? Your principal, right? But if you start drawing down your principal, what do you start to be afraid of? Running out. Now, there's a possible solution to this problem. What a good financial advisor would tell you is, well, the market has experienced a downturn, but it's temporary. It'll bounce back. It always does. Just don't take any withdrawals for the next 3 to 6 months so that we can ride this out, and then we'll start taking money again. Well, what would have happened if your employer had said, hey, it's been a little slow lately, but things are going to pick up. They always do. Just don't expect a paycheck for the next 3 to 6 months while we ride this out, and then we'll start paying you again. What kind of pickle would most people be in? I mean, how many people could actually afford to do that? And that's why you get this phenomenon of people withdrawing money and stumbling on the way down the retirement mountain, even when the markets are mostly good. See, they have to take the withdrawals no matter what because they need the money to live on. But if the goal sequence, or in this case, our sequence of returns, doesn't fall exactly right, you're going to end up in big trouble. So again, we can ladder bonds to produce income, but the drawbacks to that were no diversification and interest rate volatility. Or we could put our money in a big bucket, so to speak, and withdraw a percentage of our money each year. But the drawback to that is the markets have to cooperate. The sequence of returns has to be exactly right. So can I show you a third way? It's called the Smart Asset Income Ladder, or SAIL plan for short. And here's how it works. So John and Mary Smith are an imaginary couple with $500,000, and they need $2,000 a month in retirement to supplement their pension or Social Security. Now, this plan is specific to them, but it'll give you an idea of how a SAIL plan works. Obviously, everyone's numbers are a little bit different, and we have the software that you can show exactly how this will work for all of your clients. But John and Mary are going to ladder their portfolio according to the numbers that you see here. So asset number one is going to give them $2,000 per month, the $2,000 they need for the first 5 years. So they're getting the reliable and predictable income they need for how many years? 5, right? But at the end of the 5th year, the money in that bucket is gone. Now, sometimes people worry and they say, well, wait a minute, we're spending down our money. But what have we allowed buckets 2, 3, and 4 to do during those first 5 years? Grow. And look what they've grown to. Now we can use asset number 2 for our $2,000 per month income in years 6 through 10. So now we've been getting our reliable and predictable income for how many years? 10, right? And during those 10 years, what have we allowed buckets 3 and 4 to do? Grow. And look what they've grown to. We actually have more money than we started with. So if we wanted to, what could we do for the next 10 years? We could do it all over again. In fact, we could even give ourselves a raise to offset inflation. See, what's different about the SAIL plan is that it's a mathematically calculated ladder that plans for withdrawals. So most people have investments in their portfolio that will work in this kind of a ladder. They don't need to change all of their investments and put all their money in bonds. And again, why did we say that putting all of your money in bonds was a bad thing? No diversification and interest rate volatility, right? And you don't need the markets to cooperate to take a withdrawal. You can make systematic withdrawals without having to worry about downturns, even in good markets, because the volatility is buffered by the latter. And again, why is it good not to need the markets to cooperate before you can take a withdrawal? Because there are going to be times when we're going to need to take a withdrawal, and we could end up taking money when the markets are down, even though the market is mostly good. See, the truth is, those other plans, the bond plan, the bucket of money plan, it could work. And that's why it's often recommended. You could put all of your money in bonds and get your income that way, and you could put all your money in a big bucket of mixed investments and just withdraw a percentage of the account and get your income that way. But in both of those scenarios, the goal sequence or the sequence of returns, it has to be just right. Neither of those methods is guaranteed to work. And if you don't believe me, just go ask your financial advisor a simple question when he puts together any income plan other than a sale plan for you. Just ask him, is this guaranteed to work? And then see what he says. The sale plan is the only sure way to provide reliable and predictable income in any kind of market, and that's the key. While the other plans will provide income, only the sale plan guarantees that the income will be reliable and predictable, the kind of income that you can confidently plan on and budget around. Taking a 4 or 5% withdrawal from your portfolio means that you might have to take a pay cut when the market is down, even though the downturn may be temporary. And building a bond portfolio for income exposes you to interest rate volatility. Only the sale plan strips out the randomness that can wreak havoc on systematic withdrawals in your typical 20 to 30-year retirement. And the sale plan is the only plan that takes what we learn from gamblers and incorporates those lessons to make our income plans bulletproof. Now, no one can tell you what's going to happen in the future, so we have to be prepared for anything. And does anyone know for sure what will happen with interest rates going forward? No, we can't know that for sure. But if we had to guess, what direction would we guess that they're going to go? Knowing that, do we really want to rely on bonds for income or even for safety for that matter? Does anyone know for sure what kind of market volatility we may face in the future? No. But if we had to guess, would we guess that there's going to be less or more volatility going forward? Do we really want to have to take periodic pay cuts in retirement to protect ourselves from that volatility? See, if there was an easy way to plan for withdrawals that would eliminate the uncertainty of all that, wouldn't you at least want to know about it and look at it? And if you only take away one thing from the past hour, it should be that what worked on the way up won't automatically work on the way down. You need to have a plan for withdrawals. Now, not everyone needs income. Some people are still summiting the retirement mountain, and all they need is a set it and forget it 50-50 portfolio. So we may or may not be showing them an income plan. But the sale provides a framework for making yourself look different than all the other advisors out there when you meet with people who are looking for income or are looking for more of a plan. So a lot of you have used the sale plans, and if you're familiar with the sale software on the website, I would encourage you to kind of go back after the call and revisit the site, maybe brush up on it, maybe think about using it more often. If you're new or you're unfamiliar with the software, I would encourage you to just go out and take a look at it anyway. It's very intuitive, very easy to use and figure out. And Jerry, Matt, Jeb, I can walk you through it and help you put your first few plans together. So that's all I have for today. Remember, when you've mastered the crib notes and motive, if you're doing your 15 minutes of practice each and every day and working on your GOTS, If you're looking at your 5-minute money makers and going through the tape breakdowns, that's when you bring on every client you want, because then you have the skills to take tire kickers and plate lickers and turn them into the easiest person in the world to sell, somebody with money, no advisor, needing to do something now. And if you run across that sophisticated client, or you see a need to present more of a plan than a product, make sure you're using those 50-50 set it and forget it portfolios and putting together sale plans when appropriate. So with that, that's all I've got. I'm going to let you guys go. And remember, even though Mike's gone this week, the rest of us are here. If you need anything, just feel free to give us a call. So you guys have a great week, and we will talk to you next week, if not before. Thanks, guys.